might be normative criteria. This is something that is, as you sense already, probably very poorly developed in my mind anyway. Perhaps it can be a stimulus, if nothing more. It seems to me a very difficult question, although very interesting. In part because it addresses the whole issue, what we mean by the human. Now, my thesis, you recall, is that up to now in psychiatry, up to this very minute, the either of the two traditional schools have either been without a concept of the normative. Don't check that. Has been without a concept of the normal, or has had what is, I'm arguing, an essentially ethical conception of the normal, not a medical conception, but ethical conception. And I think it's important for me to repeat the account I tried to give before of the nature of the normal in objective descriptive psychiatry, especially at this time when objective descriptive psychiatry seems to be rampant. What I'm essentially saying is that in objective descriptive psychiatry, the symptomatic phenomena float, as it were, unattached to any account of a whole human being. You remember, I've contrasted that with the situation in general medicine, where of course, the account of the functioning body is part of the examination, part of one of the principal way in which any particular pathological phenomena is put in perspective. Right? Another way of saying what I'm saying is that one of the difficulties we have in descriptive psychiatry is that we have no way of getting perspective on a particular symptom, because we don't have a firm description of the person's total functioning in which to locate that so to speak, floating symptom. And if you could try to imagine for a moment what it would be like to practice medicine without a general sense of normal bodily functioning, I think you begin to get a sense of where we are in psychiatry. I mean, where somebody comes in and says they have a cough, I could see where you could become terribly upset by somebody having a cough, if in the course of your examination you didn't really find out about the fact that their cardiovascular system is functioning fairly well, etc., 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 so that is to reduce this, so to speak, to size. And then you contrast that to what it does for us in psychiatry when we find out that someone is hallucinating. And we're completely thrown off. It occupies the whole stage. The patient becomes someone who hallucinates. What I'm arguing is the reason that happens in psychiatry is that there really isn't an account of anything else that we're regularly giving. And that also explains to me, at least, why it is that we use adjectives in psychiatry. In the rest of medicine, you don't use adjectives. You don't say someone is cancerous or tuberculous. And the reason you don't do that is that you locate the cancer in the left upper lobe, or the rest of the person is seen as a normal human being, right? But because we have no such normatization of the patient in psychiatry, we talk about someone being schizophrenic, as if they were all schizophrenic, or manic depressive, or neurotic, or whatever. I think that explains the adjectival nature of psychiatric descriptions. And this, of course, gives to all psychopathological descriptions a tremendously ominous quality. And I can imagine that must have been the case in medicine, too, early on, when the examination of the patient was a very perfunctory thing, as it was in general medicine, even before Jenner. I imagine it must have been genuinely terrifying to everybody to find anything going on at all. I'll come back to neurology in a few moments, because there we meet an intermediate case, which, however, is still predominantly medical, which will illustrate, by contrast, our situation, this floating quality of psychiatric description. Well, that unbalancing, that possession of the patient by psychopathology, or that adjectival descriptive quality, all those things say the same thing, that gives to psychiatric diagnosing this ominous, unbalanced quality, and serves to stimulate me, and I hope maybe some of you, to think about how we can redress that balance, how we can provide means by which the the patient is more fully described. Well, that's my first argument, and my second one is the opposite, isn't it? It's that I've contended that the reason that the lack of normative phenomena in descriptive psychiatry hasn't been made more of is, first of all, because many of the people who are wedded to objective psychiatry are also wedded to biological psychiatry, and so they bootleg into psychiatry the biological criteria of normality. And you sometimes see that in objective descriptive people very clearly. They will literally mention that the patient's pulse was normal. And that's an important thing to know, of course, but it isn't a characteristic part of the description of the personality. But the other reason that there's a lack of attention to this normative problem is that, I'm contending, is that there has been dragged into, or not dragged in, galloped into psychiatry, the analytic conception of the normal, which dominates many people's thinking about the normal and makes my remarks, I'm sure, must seem very obscure to people who are really take for granted that the analytic approach to this is a sound one. Now, I've tried to shake one's conviction of the soundness of this by the description I've given of Erickson's work. You remember that essentially the point I made was that it is a sort of Scotch verdict point, that is not proven point, i.e. that there's no way of knowing whether the life cycle conception is a biological conception, a sociological conception, a religious conception, or an ethical conception. That there's no way by which one could determine that. And it is obvious, to me, and it seems obvious, that it gets its power over our thoughts from the embryological metaphor, the evolutionary metaphor, things of which I've discussed. That makes it seem probable or likely. And sometimes in Erickson's writing, that's perfectly explicit. I mean, he says it that way. That this is just a continuation of the embryological process up to death. Right? And I can see why he thinks that. I think I know why he thinks that way and why we are so willing to accept it. Because, of course, that was Freud's thing. That is, he was constantly making the jump from the body to the mind. And he made people feel good about psychological conceptions by seemingly grounding them in what looks like scientific biology. I suggest it isn't scientific biology at all. When you think of the life cycle, that is an account of human development along a single line of development with particular tasks, rituals, the whole apparatus, crises of each phase of life. This account of human life is, I suggest to you, of uncertain status. The fact that you can find elements of it in many different cultures doesn't prove much of anything. First of all, because you never know how much of those elements you find, but also because that still might be a function of cultural elements that span all peoples. We're well aware that many of the great religions have much in common, and yet we don't generally think of the great religions as therefore being expressions of biology. The closest, I suppose, anyone has come to thinking that way is Carl Jung, who saw the great religions as expressions of archetypes, and the archetypes were inherited phenomena of the unconscious. And that's, I suppose, as close as anybody's come to claiming that religion had a biological basis. Now, it may have a biological basis. Everything has to some extent a biological basis. And if we want to sort of give up and talk that way, of course, there's no argument with anybody. But it seems to me that the life cycle is a deeply flawed idea in terms of its clarity. You remember, I thought I made that point fairly tellingly when I quoted you that passage from Erickson in which he said that the normal child, if properly guided, can be trusted, the word he uses is trust, can be trusted to follow the steps of the epigenetic system. And that, I thought that if properly guided was a giveaway to the usual fact that somebody's pushing somebody around, which is not too surprising. But makes it seem something less than a unfolding, spontaneous genetic unfolding, such as one really can observe in the laboratory in certain respects in the embryological preparations. Now, why is this bad? I'm saying it's bad. Why do I think it's bad? I mean, so he's confused. Who isn't confused in this business? Well, why is it bad? And the reason I'm saying it's bad is that because we don't know what it is, because we don't know whether it's intrinsic to human nature in some sense, or whether it's imposed, right? Because of that, it becomes, as a result, an imposition. It becomes, as a result, an imposition. And once the life cycle becomes a popular way of thinking about human life, and once it is also seen as a deeply significant path for people to follow, by definition, it becomes something you're supposed to do. It becomes a way of life. And now that's perfectly all right, too. I mean, those are all around us. You can't go to a bookstore without seeing 35 different accounts of how you're supposed to live your life. But the thing about that, but those things are all different than medicine. That is, I think this notion is bad because something about medicine seems to me good. And what seems to be good about medicine is that it does not use the sick person's plight as an excuse to impose a particular view of life. That is, it is disinterested. And remember, I belabored you with my weird John Wilkes Booth example of the physician who sets this awful person's leg, right? And does so properly as a medical person. I also mentioned the modern-day version of that after another, perhaps unfortunately failed assassination attempt, when, you remember, when Ronnie got into the George Washington emergency room and said to the surgeons, "I hope you're all Republicans." You know, and they all said, or so they said, "Today we are." You know, that, in other words, you lift the political, moral world in the presence of the medical world. Okay? So that's why I think it's bad, because we can't know that it's not an ethical imposition. And therefore, it isn't our business. However, and I think it's a stunning ethical system, Erickson, but it isn't our business. And that's all I'm claiming. That's why it's bad. Yeah. There's nothing bad about having an ethical system, obviously. It's very good to have ethical systems. It's a wonderful thing to have, but I'm just trying to say that and medicine are two different universes of discourse. Now, and of course, I think there's some pressure to this contention of mine that it's bad that arises from the fact that if we don't have a normative concept in psychiatry, we're all the more likely to seize on some particular ethical concept and make that our normative concept. So it's not a trivial matter. Because if we had something to balance it off against, it would be another matter. And you can see how that problem arises in medicine and has a completely different solution. I mean, even the doctors in Virginia, for the most part, disapproved of the fact that Booth had shot Lincoln, because Lincoln was wisely regarded as a much safer leader of the ship of state than Andrew Johnson, and indeed probably would prove so. And therefore, when the doctors decided to set Booth's leg, they weren't doing it out of an ethical interest in preserving the flower of Virginia manhood. They, in fact, were doing it against their own better judgment to some extent. But the point was that the ethical matter never entered at all into that thing. I don't mean that ethics doesn't enter into medicine, because, of course, it enters in the most terrifying way possible when the patient, comes in and puts a gun down on the desk and points it at you and says, "I don't like something or other," and you want to call the police. Now, that's maybe a crazy person. Should you stay there at the danger of your life? Doing your medical duty, even if it costs you your life? Lots of doctors have been shot because they haven't called the police. But again, notice how that's illustrious. That the doctor would be likely to be shot because he wasn't trying to do the sound public protective thing, calling the police, but instead stuck with his medical disinterestedness right up to the end, until he was dead, in fact. And I think that's very foolish. Don't get shot. But that doesn't have anything to do with what your conception of your medical duties are. And I think most of us feel that if we know our patient is sick and he's going to go out and shoot somebody, even though we'll get him in trouble if we call the police, we're going to call the police. And not just because some California judge told us we had to. Well, that's the basic structure of the argument. Well, David?
There's one little problem. I don't know if you can find it relevant. Time defines to what one believes is normal. And even finding that as a point on some graph of possible.
Mhm.
It includes the normal and the aberrant.
Mhm.
In other words, finding the significant system of variables to describe the subject matter of the business doesn't exclude you from also getting into ethical problems within the realm of that business. And let me give you a concrete example. It's possible to measure the blood urea nitrogen in the patient very quickly.
Mhm.
Some of it is way out of the normal range. Sometimes it's so far out of the normal range that to keep the patient alive should perceive that to be due. You have to send them to dialysis.
Mhm.
However, there's not enough machines to dialyze everybody, hence the UN that. In order to decide who gets the benefits of that, you have to make an ethical decision. Which life is more worthwhile?
Right.
Or which job is more likely to produce a greater benefit to life?
Shouldn't someone else make that decision, though?
Well, that's a
Well, we'll get called into it anyway, certainly. We have information about it.
There are hospitals who now hire philosophers.
That's right. More and more of them.
But the
They
question
can't get a
is
job anywhere else.
I think
By the way.
not-
Right. No, that's a very important point. And I didn't mean to suggest that ethics were not of interest to because they're obviously increasingly of interest, because there is so much more power we have, and therefore so much more necessary to make decisions on the basis of limited resources. Another thing that David could have mentioned, of course, is the whole issue of eugenics, for example, whether people that do awful things should be castrated, as was done for a good many years in Denmark. Another problem concerns euthanasia, whether people that are a drain on social resources should have their plugs pulled after a certain amount of time. All those are very, very fundamental issues, obviously. Neonatology, right? The whole issue of abortion. And that's been taken out of our hands for the most part. It's a matter of the Justice Blackmun and the fruitcakes from someplace fighting it all out. But it's obviously we get into that in a significant way. Another example, of course, is this whole issue that came up recently, remember, about when life began. And some, I thought, fairly intelligent people managed to make idiots of themselves talking about that before several congressional committees. And, some people thought it was a biological question, and some people thought it was an ethical question. Nobody seemed to know quite what question it was. It ends up, of course, being, as usual, a political question.
I guess what I'm going to argue is that ultimately, if our business is the management of mind, one way or another, or soul or spirit, or however you wish to name it, that in as much as that's the domain where human relationships occur between souls, that it also comes under the sway of ethics. So that whatever other system we may be dealing with, we are also dealing in the larger scheme under an ethical system. We'll ultimately have to answer to ethical principles so that you don't get rid of ethics merely by saying that you don't wish to have an ethical system directly protecting our business.
No, I agree with that. You don't certainly get rid of it, and you wouldn't want to get rid of it. But I do think one can make some separation. It certainly isn't complete. Now, remember, I'm resting a great deal on the fact that the psychological examination, as it's generally taught and used, is without much in the way of normative values. And I discussed already the limitations of the concept of insight and compliance, which on the whole are seen as positive things. Remember, I argued that most of us, as we go through the mental states examination, are favorably impressed by the presence of insight and compliance. And I try to use those to illustrate how feeble the normative value of the mental status examination is, because I think for the most part, compliance with our questions, with our orders, etc., is as often a sign of automatic obedience, which is a sign of schizophrenia, as it is of a sound person cooperating with a wise doctor. Right? So in other words, it seems to me compliance is neutral as far as normality is concerned. On the whole, I'm impressed, perhaps from having spent too long in this institution, I'm impressed by the fact that these people answer far too many questions and are far too compliant, and that I now see compliance as a sign of illness. And I mean, I'm playing the devil's advocate a little bit. What I really mean is it doesn't tell you a damn thing about the person's health. Ditto with insight. This is, of course, still more ludicrous because, as I said before, for the most part, what people mean by insight is that the patient and the physician agree about the cause of the patient's complaint. And that isn't a bad idea necessarily, except for the fact that the physicians don't agree at all among themselves. So there's no the social psychiatrists see that blaming the parents as a sound view of the social situation, while the analysts see it as simple externalization projection. So that you don't know what to think. I mean, given an instance. Now, if you say, well, let's get away from that ideological matter and let's just simply talk about crazy ideas. And if the patient comes in and says, the moon is a green man, right? And I'm prepared to go to Judge Fox, whoever it is, sitting on the bench this month, and say that there's something cuckoo about this customer. Well, perhaps you can get away with that. But I think it illustrates very clearly that you really can't even say that. Because nothing in the mental status that I know of, this is very important to my argument, nothing in the mental status that I know of really helps you decide whether that statement, the moon is a green man, is a delusion, a poetic metaphor, or, what I think is often overlooked, an effort to feign mental illness. And in other words, it sits there, meaningless, not entirely meaningless, but robbed of much meaning by the lack of any kind of structure of normal functioning by which it could be weighed. And I know that in the harried days of filling out mental statuses and plugging them into the machines and all the rest of it, one puts these things down with a degree of confidence that reinforces the people who are reading them off the machines at the other end and give us general sense of global agreement about who only crazy people think that the moon is a green man or something. I mean, that all goes on as a general social conspiracy. But I think if you look at it more closely, it doesn't amount to a hill of beans.
I'm just a bit concerned about the vocabulary that we use. We all know that historic mental health, or I don't know like that word, but the things that we do historically derive out of medicine or treating the body. And are we making a wrong premise when we connect the two at all?
Some people think so.
Because part of what you're saying, the premise is that something that we do is similar to what medicine people do, and if we can only find the right tools, we would then have a clear idea of what we're doing.
Yeah. Well, I'm arguing that way, and your point is one that I'm very sympathetic with. That maybe that's a bad cart to hook us to. Let me show you how deeply I want to hook us to it, though. I was going to say that the neurological part of the mental status examination is a good illustration of what it really ought to be like. I'm going that far. And we all know, of course, that there is in the mental status examination something very normative, something very discreetly distinctive about normal functioning, i.e. those items that pertain to calculation, memory, orientation, sensorium, etc. Those all can be put in normative terms. You know, subtract 7 from 100. Huh? And you subtract 7 from 100. A rolling stone does something about glass houses, right? And you go run through in your somewhat embarrassed fashion these little tests, and out of it you form some idea about normal functioning. Now, I think that's very helpful. I think we don't do it much, not because it isn't helpful to a neurologist. Go over there to the neurologist and watch them do it. They do it all the time usefully. The reason we're embarrassed by it is we know it doesn't have much to do with most of our cases, and that it stands, perhaps here's the real reason, perhaps, in such marked contrast with the lack of testing materials of all the other things that we're concerned about. So what I'm claiming then is that the mental status gives us neither criteria of the normal, nor does it give us what's equally essential, a test of those criteria. Now that point is very appealing to me. That in medicine, it isn't that you just have an idea about the normal function. You have these great pictures in your head of the circulation, right? The inferior mesenteric artery. It isn't just that you've got all those things in your head. The fact is, you know where to put your finger, more or less, to find out what the pulse is. Now you test it. And the whole determination of the normal is based upon a whole series of tests. And again, that's of course illustrated very clearly in the neurological part of medicine. So what I want us to do, and I'm going to make some brief, very cursory and inadequate passes in this direction, but what I want us to do is to develop criteria of humanness, and not only criteria of humanness, but tests for their presence and absence. Because without the second, the first is simply an abstraction. Now you see how I come back and argue this all over again by saying, well, I know delusions are a bad idea. The moon is not a green man, right? And, okay, well, delusions are sometimes point to something. Yes, but there's nothing I'm arguing in the mental states that allows you to differentiate the poetic metaphor, the feigned illness, and the genuine delusion in the mental state. And until you have that, you're helpless, I'm saying. Now, notice, as in so many other things in our business, how Freud foreshadowed this formulation. And if you think of psychoanalysis, it's a beautiful instance of a primitive psychiatric development, a brilliant but primitive psychiatric development. Here's a way you could make that case. Well, I was thinking another way. See, Freud also suggested we have to test. And that's one of the most interesting things about his formulation of psychoanalysis. There were many times he said you could only arrive at the diagnosis if you subjected the patient to the analysis. Now, that's a form of testing. In other words, and only when the transference was allowed its full development would you be in a position to surface the neurosis. That's very fundamental to analytic thinking. Now, that's precisely what I mean. The only trouble with that is, as a device, is of course it's extremely cumbersome. As I mentioned a few weeks ago, that if you subject people to that, very often you find out that the conditions that you discover by that means are ones that you can't treat by that means. So you're in a very embarrassing position. Furthermore, by that time the patient is so crazy or so broke you can't afford any other kind of treatment either. But that's typical of primitive developments in any field. And but it nevertheless points us in the right direction, in my judgment. That is, you need, however, not a cumbersome method of testing this extent of human or lack of human function, but you need some convenient method of testing. So that gives me courage in pursuit of this.
Wouldn't Freud have said, once we figure this all out to its end, that you would find that everything really has a biological substrate?
He did that, but I think myself that Freud can be quoted on every side of the issues, and that's not a dumb place to be in a field like ours. I mean, we mentioned last time we met the wonderful articles that Bettelheim had in the New Yorker a week or two ago, in which he argues very eloquently and very persuasively with his typical arrogant confidence that of course what Freud really meant was that id meant it and ego meant I, and where it was I should be, a typical existential statement. Right? And that the whole thing went wrong because a lot of silly Americans translated into mechanical language and left out the soul, which Freud always was in there. That's Bettelheim's argument. I wondered, as I'm sure many of you did, whether that wasn't an attempt to screw the New York Analytic Association and poor old Janet Malcolm and what's his name, Aaron Green, at the credit of previous years' excursus into psychoanalysis in the New Yorker. Anyway, putting that aside, the trouble with Bettelheim's argument is so plain that I'm surprised that they published it. I don't know if he wanted it published, they couldn't resist it. It's so willful. But anyway, the trouble with it is, of course, that Freud spoke and wrote excellent English, knew exactly what the words that were used throughout the
But he makes that point himself in the article. He says Freud spoke and wrote good English, and he knew what was being written, but that it had some more to do with his attitude towards the Americans and with his...
That's a
And
soft
also
place to
towards
land.
the translators. I believe the quotation
Yes.
is Freud said,
I'd rather
he
have a
needed
good,
friends,
more than
I'd
translator.
rather have a good friend than a good translator.
Well, he's obviously wrestling with the problem, it seems to me.
No,
He skirts it.
He's great, but I mean,
He gives an ambiguous remark that Freud made that doesn't really explain why he let the translation stand.
I mean, if you wanted to attack his general formulation, leave aside the English and the Americans. In his own German, I mean, he read the Projects for Scientific Psychology. If that has anything to do with the soul,
But that was shelved, right?
Well, it was shelved, but it was not shelved. I mean, it's popular to say it was shelved, but he kept coming back to it in his letters, and he was fascinated by the idea, and he would have loved to have made physicalistic discoveries. I mean, this is
entire
the...
system was an
It-
exegesis of that.
Who, me?
His entire system was an exegesis.
Could well be looked upon that way, at least a great deal of it. And again, in the same line, he says over and over again that, not over and over, he says 3 or 4 times, that sooner or later we'll discover it's all hormonal and chemical anyway. Where's the soul then? So that the fact is, he did the same thing on the issue of reality and fantasy in terms of symptoms. Sometimes he sounded as if he thought the patients were really seduced. Sometimes he made a great deal of the social matrix. Other times he sounded like a typical Germanic, like Verblendungsprozesse, this sort of secret inner thing that's driving us all wacky. The Germans have always seemed to have been on board. So he was on, and why? For the best of all reasons. He didn't know. So one time it would look one way, it would look another. And, consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. And that, and Freud was not a small mind.
Yeah, I think you get to the point of saying, agreeing with Freud's viewpoint, and even if in some future days we were able to tell exactly what every neuron was doing and behaving, and could actually understand every feeling, not from experience, but from a mechanistic viewpoint, there still wouldn't be a guideline to as to what people should feel or what people should think.
And probably at that point you'd be studying language, not neurons anyway. Right? Exactly.
If we had an incredibly enlarged pharmacopoeia, we still, and it could make someone feel any emotion we chose. I don't think that would be a guideline.
No, it certainly would. In fact, it would be a precise guideline against treatment, wouldn't it? Because it would put in the hands of a lot of scientific freakos the chance to manipulate the human race. God forbid that we should ever get there. Just as God forbid that should ever be powerful psychological tools, which you bet your life will be taken up by the same bastards. And the discovery of propaganda and public relations in this century was one of the major tools that Hitler had in his hand. So we may look back with great happiness to the time when our powers were as feeble as they are then. Well, those things are obviously arguable, and maybe Bettelheim's right, or maybe the mechanists are right. It's very hard. It seems to me it's very hard to say. But I mentioned the psychoanalytic thing because it seems to me that Freud was sort of on the right track in terms of wanting to have some kind of method by which one could test the preparation at hand. Again, that perhaps is in keeping with his medical and bodily orientation, which perhaps I'm too much of a victim of too. Now, I wanted in the hour and a half or so that we have left to make some suggestions about what the criteria of humanness might be that you would test, and the means by which you would want to test it. Embedded in that effort is a larger effort, a very ambitious effort, which would be fun to spend the rest of one's life working on, but I haven't worked on it much, so it's very feeble in my mind as yet, and that is the idea of trying to describe the function of psychopathology. That is, in other words, so that when you talked about a symptom in the mental status, you related it to some normal function of which it was a distortion or an extension. That would be a very exciting thing to do. You might say it's already been partly done, because, of course, the psychoanalytic metapsychology is an effort to produce an apparatus of mind which produces symptoms. And we can talk about that issue as we go along, if you want. I think there there are such restrictions on its application in practice that it doesn't provide us with a normal test or basis, but we may disagree with it. The first of the human functions, which I thought was the one that's most appealing to me, and of course sort of falls out of the ideas I've been talking about in terms of existential and empathic method. The first of these is what I call the range of motion. And of course I like that because that's a way of bootlegging in a sort of orthopedic metaphor. That is, if one could describe the range of motion of a limb, one is describing a normal function. And if one could describe an interpersonal range of motion, one would be similarly forming some interesting idea about how the person functions socially. But what I meant by range of motion was the patient's ability to both be close and distant. I make a lot of fuss about this in part because, again, our lack of normative values shows up strikingly on the fact that people generally tend to applaud intimacy and not to notice whether a person's intimacy is forced. In other words, whether they're capable of distance. And nothing has more impressed itself upon my aging mind than the fact that it's just as important to be able to get away from people as to get close to them. Indeed, they often are closely related. And that the range of motion, the fact that one is free to be intimate, is nicely encompasses, in my opinion, the fact that is that one wants to be able to be intimate, but one also wants to be able to take flight.
Yeah, there's a concrete problem with using that phrase, and I don't know how attached you are to that phrase, and that is when you write it down on the mental status exam, people don't know what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
How else could you phrase that?
Mm-hmm.
Or how would you want it phrased? When you say range of motion, what people think of as range of motion?
Right.
Is there another way of saying that would be
Social spectrum.
social spectrum?
Social range.
Social range.
Intimacy and self-protectiveness. You use a kind of semantic, Osgood semantic differential. Set up a thing with one at each end and continue. Notice there that the middle point is not intimacy. The middle point is the capacity to move to either end.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would, as I say, the only value of these criteria are if I can accompany them with speedy tests. Speedy tests. Okay, and I'll show you how to do it. Now, you test for intimacy. You test for the capacity of the patient to remain close, say in a distant patient, right? Say you have somebody who comes into the emergency room and they're going crazy, right? They're brought in by their mother, and the mother says, Henry has been staring out the window for 4 days and has not eaten, right? Or Henry went outside yesterday with no clothes on and told his sister that she was a dirty something, right? Henry's previously been very well behaved indeed. So that the patient is brought in, right? And you sit down and you look at them and they look a little flaky. You can feel their mind going out into the parking lot, right? They are at a great distance. And there are lots of ways we say that. We say they're out in left field. That's a far away, not in Fenway Park, but in many ways it's a far distance left field. And all that's the way we speak of that distance. And now we're going to try to determine this poor person's range of motion. So I will make a series of empathic remarks and see if that person can stay close to me, or whether they have to flee, whether they can disappear, whether they'll go on disappearing, or whether I can hold them, whether I can stay close to them, whether they can stand me close to them. That's my first test of whether they're capable of intimacy. And I found over the years that if you can do that with an acutely psychotic person, you can generally keep them going crazy. You can hold them. Well, some you can't. They go out, and they're much harder, in my experience. and whether you use medications or not.
So the examiner makes the impact.
The examiner makes the empathic remark and sees if he can establish closeness. So that's the test of closeness. That's my first test of closeness.
The other possibility would be for the examiner to complain about something to see whether or not the person could be impacted.
Right.
Rather than just have a shitty experience.
See if you get a least bit of interest. See if they can draw their attention to you, or they're so preoccupied with themselves, like narcissistic people. They don't even notice. It'd be another way.
So it's kind of
Take another kind of person that's distant. Take someone who's cold. Say a very obsessional character, holds everybody off in a kind of spiky way. And you want to know whether they're capable of closeness. Now, I don't mean that the test is the only way to do it. You also do other things. You say to the wife, or you say to them, you got a friend, or what's it like with this person. I mean, you do all those things, and they sometimes get you information, they sometimes don't. But I think that, again, the risk of saying the same thing over and over again ad nauseum, that it's important to have some way of determining it, from the immediate contact, like the pulse rather than the history of cardiac rhythm. So, to that person, you attempt to get closer. There are lots of things you can do. Try moving a little closer and seeing if they move away. Again, make an empathic remark and see if they will admit you into their empyrean of feelings. And I'm sure there are other things that one can do to test for the individual's capacity for closeness. Now, let's drop that for a minute. How would you determine if somebody was capable of getting distant? Well, I hear there are a lot of different other clinical presentations which you might want to decide. One of the favorite ones for all of us in this institution is that person that cannot leave us alone. They move right in. Many involutional depressions are like this when you first meet them. And many borderline people will come on to you that same way. They just move right in, there's no distance, but you feel stifled when you're with them. Now, that doesn't mean they can't stand distance. You haven't tested that yet. See, there's again the kind of point I want to make. You can't just say they're incapable of distance. You haven't tested it yet. Because they may be very capable of distance, and they just like you. I don't know. Anyway, so somebody comes in, they move into you, right? You're tempted to leave the room. Try it if you like. See what happens. Many of them will follow you right out, so, indicating that they don't want to be alone. Maybe they can't be alone. Huh? Now that's, on the whole, cumbersome, like all concrete tests of that. So let's do something a little bit different. You see them coming on, right? They're moving in on you. You become distracted. You don't pay attention. You become out to lunch. And watch what happens. They may, if they can't stand you, not to be thinking about them, not to be close to them, they may become distracted. They may say, "Are you paying attention?" They may do all kinds of "Are you all right, doctor?" All kinds of things in which they press on your presence there. Now, relatively normal people, when they notice that you're out to lunch, will maybe say something like, "Okay, hello, I know sometimes crazy don't get moved, chance, that kind of thing, right?" And then they realize that you stay out. They don't pursue it. They draw back in and they're all right by themselves. In other words, they're not compelled to be close. But people who can't stand to be alone will move and stay right within more than one clinical posture. I think once again, of course, if one is solely devoted to maintaining a steady and authentic reality for one's patients, because that's what really helps. We've been all told that too. Then, of course, what I'm saying is just so much hot air or worse. It really does require you're allowing yourself to be absent or present, as opposed to fixed vigilantly on the patient, an attitude which is terrifying when you think about it. If you've been a victim of it.
It seems if you continue to conduct your therapy in a way such that you could be distant, or that you would choose different roles, you would give your patient a lot more opportunity to learn about themselves than if you just presented one consistent front, for the simple reason that there's a lot more people like the various types of people you represented than just one trend.
I feel very strongly about that. Also give your patient a chance to show you many sides of himself or herself in a fixed role. That's the central Sullivanian question, isn't it? The central Sullivanian question is the patient the way they appear to be solely because you're the way you appear to be? In other words, is the reason that all my slides look yellow and green is because all I have is hematoxylin E, right? That's the Sullivanian question. While if, on the other hand, you change your persona in the present version, and you're testing out whether that's a stable image that the person has presented themselves.
I think it's important to distinguish examination here. Two things. One is, and I think there's a test for each that you're proposing. One is the first test, which you talked about, range of motion or intent, is really a test of the patient's ability to tolerate closeness. And then if you were to feign illness, it would be a test of the patient's ability to come close. Just as if the doctor is, being inattentive, it would be a test of the patient's ability to tolerate distance. And on the other hand, if the doctor was to say something like, "You really are a really unbelievably stupid human being for walking into a place like this, and anybody who would come into a place like this has got to be worthless, therefore you're in the right place." And, if the doctor were then to attack the patient, does the patient have the ability to distance? So one is their ability to tolerate distance, the other is the ability to achieve distance, one is the ability to tolerate close. So it would be important to be specific about what we were testing the patient's ability, is what I'm asking, suggesting.
Well, telling me, I agree with you. I don't mean these criteria by any means adequate.
Yeah. It could be called the range of social motion. How's that?
Range of social motion, okay?
Just so it's in.
Other problems in this David touches on this probably about what self-protective capacity does the patient have? I think our general examination is extraordinarily effective in telling us that. Because if the patient really answers our questions in any thoroughgoing way, it's highly likely that they have serious deficiencies in social skills, I think. And that you should entertain the serious possibility that they have indeed even automatic obedience. If you've got a full-blown schizophrenic state on your hands, if you proved it by the detail in which your history is accumulated. So, things are by no means that simple, but I make my point perhaps vividly that way. Well, I just want to mention two or three other things in the few minutes that we'll have today that maybe you, as I say, I don't really feel much, I understand much about this. I would like to be able to form some judgment of imaginative freedom. A couple of us talked briefly about humor. For example, the capacity to laugh, the capacity to see a joke. What does that tell us? It certainly partly falls within the category of imaginative freedom. For example, many jokes are tests of our aggressive and sexual freedom. That is, our capacity to imagine a pratfall or a dirty situation, if you like. And that the capacity to enjoy a joke is really an empathic expression. No, that's not right. It's an empathic act of sharing hostile or sexual acts, essentially. And if you are so inhibited that you can't do that, that you think that to hurt somebody would be bad, most humor will pass you by. Because most humor involves somebody getting hurt or sexually involved in some way or other, humiliated and asked of. That's a great part of jokes. And the incongruities, as I mentioned to some of you, that the simple fact of incongruity is a joke at a certain age. My 3.5-year-old daughter thinks it's funny when she imagines an automobile in the refrigerator. That's a joke. And when we go over the articles and the jokes in the New Yorker each week, she doesn't think most of them are funny unless, as I mentioned to you, a tree looks like it's coming out of the roof because of it's painted in the back of the picture. That she thinks is funny. And obviously we're talking about developmental things in part, too. But for the most part, you will not think it's very funny if I mention that the car is in the refrigerator or something like that kind of. It generally involves something happening to somebody of a ludicrous, sexually and aggressively, and generally ludicrous nature. And you may secretly snicker about it in a kind of prurient way, but your capacity to enter into it humorously is, I would argue, a sign of your imaginative freedom. Or put another way, you're not so inhibited that you can't enjoy imagining such and such happening. So that humor, among other things, seems to be a test of imaginative freedom. And whether the mental status examination would profit, as we were discussing, some of us a few weeks ago, from adding to this boring stock of proverbs a joke or two. I don't know. At least would be funny. Would have that as kind of in a procedure which is certainly not exactly a barrel of laughs at this point. And,
yeah, some in mind, absolutely.
well, I don't know. I mean, I have. This David here was talking about some study of it. It's obviously a large matter. There are people with millions and millions of jokes, and I'm sure they've been classified in lots and lots of different ways. And it might be fun to take some of those classifications and think about them clinically. You could write a paper in 20 minutes, which is about as long as it takes many of these papers. So you go to lunch. You start with manic punning, right? Which is very funny, isn't it? It makes us all laugh and begin to think about that. What's the place of the kind of imaginative freedom the manic person has? See what enormous, in fact, from the existential point of view. Remember, mania is a condition of imaginative cutting loose. You've lost the ground of reality in your imaginative flight. So that would be, we could use that as an argument for humor as a sign of imaginative freedom. And then, of course, you could turn that upside down in your second paragraph and say, the depressed people are not at all funny, are they, by definition? How many jokes have you ever heard a depressed person tell you? Maybe occasionally some awfully mordant thing, but nothing much. And why is that? Because, of course, their imaginative freedom is gone. They are admired in the past. Right? So rather than the past being funny, the past is a source of regret, horror, dismay, blah, 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 blah. So you could begin to move around in that territory, and how is the best way on earth to test for the depth of depression? How much trouble you have to go to make a depressed person laugh? We've got the Hamilton Depression Scale, which itself, in my opinion, is extremely depressing. But maybe you could try putting that against the Hamilton Depressive Scale. See how you do.
Turn on George Carlin records. See how many jokes he had to tell.
All right. Well, comedians will tell you. Comedians will tell you that I've been talking to comedians all my life, but I've heard comedians say that they have to work harder some nights.
Seems like there should be a one-liner that you could slip in there with the Proverbs. And somewhere.
Well, why not? I mean, my God, some jerk back there, nameless, widely nameless, was responsible for these proverbs. And why can't you move ahead?
They often elicit humor. The Proverbs do, because some people find them absurd.
Yeah.
Not only do they find the content absurd, but being asked these questions in that context
Yeah.
seems absurd.
Especially when it matches our embarrassment at asking. Try and make an acute schizophrenic person laugh. I've exercised myself on that. That's interesting. Someone who's losing his mind. You'll be scared to do it for the most part because it seems so inappropriate and so horrifying.
They can't laugh, and I wonder what kind of lines we could draw for the diagnostic categories in terms of the antagonism.
Claims that they want to use psychology for making the diagnosis of something like that book. But people that work in business.
That's so.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. David is very systematic. Does he have a test?
Apparently, did anyone else hear that? I'm sure he said that. I've read
I was-
that as well.
Oh, was there? He didn't mention a test.
He didn't mention tests.
That's fascinating.
Well, there's a whole bunch of things, and I mean,
Does that
for
mean the sense
example,
of humor is in the temporal lobe? Does that mean that the sense of humor is localized in the temporal lobe? I don't know. Can't be.
I don't know, because a lot of the so-called temporal lobe phenomena are not temporal lobe phenomena. They're questions of influence of the temporal lobe that shoots back and forth as you might anticipate. Is it hypersexuality or hyposexuality? Hypo.
Depends on whether it's bilateral. It's bilateral.
I think a lot of it is very preliminary.
Is that true, David, or did you just say that like very serious? Like,
No, seriously. You have
you said it like someone on Grand Rounds of the General.
no,
3 years later, they found out what you meant.
Well, it's true. Both temporal lobes are disturbed. Hypersexuality is a component of proven use of bilateral.
Maybe that's where my confusion was. No, I meant not knowing which was. It's both under something.
I've tried to make schizophrenic laugh so far, depending on the state, it doesn't work. There are some who seem to be coming back when you get some few friends out, things like safety. You know, that they're just trying to get rid of them or have a relationship and solve the question. The one that
And of course,
What
there's always the
is the
inappropriate
effect
laugh.
of phenothiazines on the sense of humor?
Well,
If it,
It's-
I mean, you know my favorite notion that they work through some kind of sexual midbrain effect. And do they have a bigger effect on aggressive or sexual jokes?
my schizophrenic is on 50 milligrams of alcohol on the screen.
Is a screen.
That's the ability to do that. So again, the ability to create, the ability to be funny, and the ability to laugh at something that is funny, are maybe again 2 different capabilities.
Sharing a joke is different.
You would want to know whether or not the person could laugh at something that was funny, and you would want to know whether or not the person could make you laugh.
Yeah. Well, that's a very interesting point. I mean, you often, in your own personal experience and your psychotherapeutic experience, have patients tell you that one of the things they hope they'll get out of psychotherapy is the capacity to tell a joke. They always forget jokes or get inhibited when they tell a joke. That's a very, I must have heard that 100 times in the course of my practice. That wish to, it's partly an exhibitionistic inhibition that's present in that, isn't it? Make people laugh. So that would be another thing to test. Mm-hmm. I just want to mention a third category of things that I would like to test, where I haven't touched about the whole issue of creativity. It'd be nice to, especially since many of our patients, many crazy people in my experience, are sustained by a creative capacity. It would be nice to get that straight at some point in the course of knowing them. Certainly part of creativity is an imaginative freedom. So you might, just one might interest oneself in that way. You'll sometimes have the experience, I'm sure that I've already had it, that I've had many times, of meeting people who look totally, straight, totally uninterested, just as tight as a drum, right? Who have in a certain area a degree of imaginative freedom that takes your breath away. And so that,
Yeah.
and so when you talk about the patient as an obsessional person with all this business, you're really overlooking what maybe is really the sustaining thing about them and of enormous interest, The fact that that in some places their minds can do hops, skips, and jumps that you couldn't follow in 1,000 years. Well, the third thing, and as I say, I don't feel very incomplete, but anyway, has to do with the existential interest in mortality and uncertainty, and what people like to emphasize around here, the capacity to say goodbye. We all know that's become a kind of religion in this building, saying goodbye. Saying goodbye, or
It's getting worse.
getting worse. And,
In terms of what? I mean,
can you say goodbye? Have you ever said goodbye? Well, I guess we've all said goodbye. Goodbye, you know.
Not
But
without
I
a
mean,
tape recorder.
But that's right. To what extent have you really said goodbye to anybody? See how that relates to the existential concept of mortality. That is the acceptance of mortality, of limits, of nothingness as such of itself. And are you in touch with that finitude? All lots of different languages for this kind of thing. And I'm very impressed by how many people wandering around everywhere have really avoided that, any kind of confrontation with that all their lives. There are various ways to do that. One would like to know something about that. How would you determine that? Uncertainty is another thing like that. I've been working with a man for 3 years, and it came as a shock to me, and I wasn't how much as he surprised me. It came as a shock to me to gradually have it dawn on me that this man had no place in his system for the notion of uncertainty. That's an exaggeration, but there's some truth to that. And as I say, I don't think I should have been surprised in retrospect. Well, that's a threefold system. What gives it any systematic rigor? Nothing that I can see. Then I thought to myself, well, now, I've been trying to reorganize the model of psychotherapy on the notion of the head and the heart and the hand and the eye. So basic psychological functions. The good therapist is in possession of head, heart, eye, and hand. He can do handing is called Sullivanism, hearting is existential empathy, my little system. We all ought to be able to do them all, more or less, right? But maybe that could be turned around and be the basis of the judgment of the normal. That we might try to decide whether the patient can see, think, feel, and manage. Maybe that would be a more systematic basis of the description of human functioning. I don't know. But the more I thought about this, and it's only been relatively recently with me, the more convinced I am that it really would serve a very great purpose and might, as I say, help us get into significantly better perspective these awful things we say about people, this adjectival description of people as manic and schizophrenic. Well, we'll return to that next week. How do you test for a person's capacity for uncertainty or to say goodbye? Oh, but we know how we do it, don't we? Have you ever said goodbye to anyone? Well, that's a question. It's a sensible question sometimes. It doesn't bring you a whole lot of information on the whole. Generally, don't find out about it until you say terminate yourself with the patient.
you might be able to test for uncertainty in the hour, which might be some indication of it.
By giving them conflicting ideas, say. Huh? That's interesting.
Or conflicting orders.
Conflicting orders. Okay.
So what happened with this 20th century psychiatry module?
I dropped it.
Dropped.
I dropped it. Yeah. I
You're
finished
not going to go?
Huh?
No, they.
Oh, I'm going. I finished it. I wrote the thing. Roughly today. I thought I would go. If I'm only going to be here for a time or two more, but I should try to finish this up.
No, I was referring to something else. At one point you said you dropped that article, the lead article from the Green Journal, a program for 20th century psychiatry.
Roberto Unger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And said that perhaps that was something we could.
Unger? Unger did.
Unger wrote that?
Did you see it?
No, but I know he wrote a book called Knowledge in Politics. It's the same one. You see at Harvard Law School.
Yep.
Yeah.
Is his middle name Magna Piero?
Yep.
Yeah. Where's he
That's
from?
a very brilliant man.
Oh, you haven't seen the piece yet? The lead article?
Oh,
You haven't?
I've got
Don't
it.
Give it to me.
Isn't it fascinating?
I think so, and
I think it is superb. I've been calling to have lunch with him very soon. I wanted to meet
He's a
him.
very brilliant man. The
Oh,
story that I
is
heard
he
about
ever?
him.
I have friends that have taken his courses.
Yes, I went to listen to his lectures at the law school
Is that
once
so?
because I read part of his book and it was a stupendous piece of work.
I mean, he had just absolute pitch for our business.
He has no degree, that man.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, that,
He
maybe
was
that's the reason.
Enfant terrible from somewhere in South America. I believe it was Chile. I'm not sure. And some professor from the law school was visiting down there and heard him speak and spent some time talking with him and invited him to come and teach.
Great. Good for them.
David,
Boy.
when you said article,
This was last month. It's a lead article.
But you have it in possession and you will loan it to me?
Sure.
Okay.
That's not one of them. Oh, yeah, really, it is.
But
We
this
should
is
talk
what
about it
I
here.
would like to.
Oh, yes. Well, I was absolutely knocked off my feet.
And you're going to have lunch with him next week?
Not next weekend. I really was thrilled by that. Oh.
I would like very much to discuss it. I mean, there's a lot.
Well, if we don't have a chance to do it here, we'll have to do it some other time.